I'm Paul. I work on Open Service Broker API and Service Catalog at Red Hat. And I'm going to talk today about those things. People still hear me back here? Looks like it. All right. So before we get started, can I see a show of hands? How many people have read or watched one of the Commons briefings about catalog? Okay, so a fair amount. How many people have deployed catalog in production with OpenShift 3.7?
It's not supported in production.
It is supported in 3.7.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Bam. Okay, so today's agenda is first to get my clicker working here. There we go. We're going to do like a brief overview of Service Catalog and Open Service Broker API. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can make your service available. And I'm going to show also a joint project between Red Hat and Rocket Chat as an example of like an ISV that has worked with us to expose their service in this manner. And then I'm going to show a new project that I'm really excited about making new brokers. So here we go. Service Catalog in 5 minutes. The TLDR of Open Service Broker API is that it is a mechanism that insulates a user that wants to provision a new instance of a particular service from how that happens. If you've worked in companies large and small, you're probably familiar with this concept. You may have a passing familiarity with making a ticket to get something to happen, like getting a chassis racked, getting a new database created, all that kind of stuff. Raise your hand if you like making tickets. You know, I don't see any hands, and you'll notice that my hand is not up here. So I think we all are on a similar emotional wavelength about tickets, making them, waiting for them to happen, et cetera. And that's where the value proposition of Open Service Broker API really hits the sweet spot, because a service broker that manages the operations of provisioning a new service, creating bindings to them when you want to use them, insulates you from the gory details of how that happens. And that sounds good to me, right? Like I know too much already. I don't want to know how the database gets created. I really, really don't. And Service Catalog, oh, I got ahead of myself. So let's talk about the high-level details of that. Open Service Broker API has basically 5 operations, which is convenient because I count on my fingers a lot since my brain isn't very good. And this matches the number of fingers that I have. So we got catalog management, which is what services does my broker offer? The next one is provisioning, which is how do I make a new instance of that service? And the canonical example that we use to explain this stuff is, say a service might be database as a service. So you provision a new database, and then you've got your database that you can use. Binding is you want to consume that service. You want to consume that database in an application and write to it, read from it. And then you've got the symmetric pairs of those two things, so unbinding and deprovisioning. Service Catalog is an integration point between OpenShift and Kubernetes and one or more brokers that implement this Open Service Broker API. And I'm going to show in a little bit the mechanics of how that all fits together. But essentially, Service Catalog sits between you as a user and brokers that are out there connected to the catalog. So you actually have to know even less about Open Service Broker API than someone who implements it or implemented Service Catalog. You basically just get to say what you want and when you want to use it. And when you're done, you delete the resources that represent those things. They go away. Really quick, because I'm sure this is at least somewhat interesting to the people in this room. The architecture of Service Catalog is similar to the architecture of Kubernetes in that Service Catalog has its own API server and presents API resources that have the same kind of spec and status pattern as other resources in Kubernetes that you might be familiar with. That API server is backed by a controller that is going and doing the work of actually talking to brokers that implement this API. And it's an eventually consistent API, just like other APIs in Kubernetes. So you say what you want, and this controller is constantly reconciling to make that happen. And when you, make a request to bind and get credentials for a service that you provision, that controller handles plunking those down into the Kubernetes API and secrets. So in 3.7, as we've already mentioned in passing, Service Catalog is supported in OCP 3.7. There's support for it in the installer. You can create a new cluster with Service Catalog enabled. You can upgrade a 3.6 cluster to 3.7 and install the catalog in doing that. And we've recently fixed some bugs around that experience, so that should all be working great in our next errata release. So you get the catalog infrastructure. You get two brokers. There's a template service broker, which is an implementation of the Open Service Broker API that uses OpenShift templates underneath to provision and bind to services. And you get the Ansible service broker, which I think probably there's some degree of familiarity with this Ansible thing in this room. People have probably heard of that. And then also, you can easily create, if you want to just test this out and take it for a spin, OC Cluster Up has a feature now where you can make a cluster with the service catalog installed. So on that note, let's talk about making your service available. Those two brokers that we talked about are easy on-ramps. If you can write an OpenShift template, you can integrate with the template service broker. If you can write Ansible playbooks, you can integrate with the now called the automation service broker, which, just for the record, I believe has the coolest, oh, I'm showing my jokes, all that stuff. Hold on a sec. I think I closed my window. Well, that's all right. Forget you saw that. Laugh when you see it, like it's the first time. These two brokers are easy on-ramps. Like I was saying, if you can write Ansible playbooks, you can expose a service via the Ansible broker, and I'm going to show an example of that. Let me see if I can hit this button the right way. This, I think, for the record, is the coolest logo in the container space, the tentacle. So let's take a look. So I've got an OCP 3.7 cluster running in EC2. It's in the US East 1 region, so it's going to be maybe a little slower than if it was running closer to us, but it'll work. It'll get the job done. And I'm going to show Rocket Chat being provisioned via Ansible Playbook Bundle. So basically an Ansible Playbook Bundle is a container image that has the Ansible runtime, and it's got Ansible playbooks for these provision, bind, unbind, and deprovision operations that when the service catalog calls those operations in Open Service Broker API, the Ansible broker just runs a pod that runs that Ansible playbook. And this is a really cool example to me because we, at Red Hat, initially developed a version of this, and then via our ISV channel, actually worked with Rocket Chat, and they have full rights to the Ansible playbook repo and actually maintain this, which is really cool. So if we have any interest in doing that, I can put folks in touch with the people to talk to if you're interested in doing something like this. So you can see here, you got a nice little icon, a description, image dependencies, and we're going to create a new project here. Let's call this Commons Demo. Just a note to myself. All right, let's go ahead and create this thing. So when I hit create, what happened is there's a Kubernetes service catalog resource called service instance that was created in my project. And when I create that resource, it represents my intent to provision a new instance of this Rocket Chat service. So I created it. The service catalog controller is watching service catalog API server and says, aha, there's a new service instance that I need to make real. So it's going to go out and talk to the Ansible broker and say, I want this service, I want this plan. Ansible broker says, thank you very much for letting me know. I'm going to go and do it. And it will, in this particular flow, since there's work to do here that you can't really squeeze into a single API call, it'll say, I've accepted your request, call me back, I'll let you know what's happening. And it will go about its merry way doing the work of provisioning, and we don't have to know how that happens, which is the best part of this. So let's go ahead and see if this is going to work. Looks like things are going okay so far. Let's drill into this. All right, pending. Sometimes this works really fast. Yeah. So maybe I can pause here while this is doing its thing and see if there's any questions so far. Don't be shy.
So when we execute the service catalog, which account is it executed with? Like, can we provide a service account when you are executing the service catalog?
Excellent question. So the question was, when, I think there's actually a couple different questions. Yeah. There's one question of, does the service catalog run under a particular service account? And then there's a closely related question of, does a particular broker run under a service account? The answer to both those is yes. And to just take it apart a little bit, the service catalog runs in its own namespace under a service account that is limited in what it can actually do. The Ansible broker also runs in a service in its own separate namespace, and I can dig into those really quick. Yes. There we go. Is that visible? One more for good luck. The Ansible service broker actually runs in its own namespace under its own service account that is permission to do only the things that it needs to do. We'll back this down. We had too much good luck there, so need to fit it all on one screen. You can see here, I've just got all the pods and all the namespaces, and there's Ansible Service Broker itself. Ansible Service Brokers at CD are running under their own namespace. We've got my namespace here with the Rocket Chat pod, which seems like this was a perfect question timing-wise because it looks like the thing is done. And there are a couple other layers of security here. So when the service catalog is talking to the Ansible broker, it is sending information about the namespace that is requested, the namespace that's requested that the instance be provisioned. And it's also sending information about itself so that the broker can authenticate that the service catalog is actually using a service account that's able to talk to it. So there's a special RBAC rule that when the broker gets a request, it does a Kubernetes subject access review check against a special verb, basically, that says you can call me, so that you can make sure, one, that just because you know where the Ansible broker might be listening for requests, that you can only get it to do things for you if you have permission to talk to it. And then at another layer, the Ansible service broker itself is protected from the rest of the system with RBAC, so it can only do the things that it's supposed to be able to. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was wondering, is it possible to configure a service broker or service account to apply SCC? So you're creating a new namespace, and your new namespace needs the NEU8 SCC, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you do that? But that sits outside now.
So that's a really good question. The question, just for the record, was, can you apply a security context constraint to the service account that the Ansible service broker runs as? So for example, if you want to make sure that the Ansible service broker's pods only run within a certain UID range, totally possible to do. You do that just like you would configure an SCC for any other service account. So let's take a look here. All right, we've got Rocket Chat. And let's go to let's actually go and take a look at that service. All right. So I'll just make an account really quick here. I'm doing the wrong thing, of course. If anybody can't guess the password that I'm typing, it's 123456. All right, look at that. I wonder if I can direct message myself. What a relief. My buddy Paul on here says that so far it's working, so I've got that going for me. So that's Ansible Service Broker. One thing that I have gotten a lot of questions about, actually I'm going to go back to my deck here, is maybe for some reason I don't want to use OpenShift templates or I don't want to use Ansible. Is there a good way to make my own broker? And I've been asked this question several times in the period since we did the initial alpha release of Service Catalog and then had the tech preview version in OpenShift 3.6. And for a long time, I didn't have a good answer for that. Until a week ago, where enough people asked me this question, and enough people had very good reasons to want it and not to want to build it themselves. So we made a new thing. It's called the OSB Starter Pack, and the idea is that it is a really simple, because that's all I can handle, way to bootstrap your own broker and integrate it into the service catalog. So let's build a broker. This project used to be called the Go Open Service Broker Skeleton, and keep that in mind when I finally get to my joke slide, because I'm not going to build a broker yet. I was thinking, while I was thinking about how to do this the right way, like I said, I called it the skeleton, and I was thinking, you know, there's people skeletons, and we draw all these pictures on whiteboards where these boxes are. What do the box skeletons look like? I think there's 4 bones in the box skeleton. So I'm drawing on the whiteboard here. I got my frobulator box or my widget or whatever. There are 4 bones that keep the skin of this box in the square shape that we know and love. I don't know what their names are, but if I apply my X-ray vision, that's what I see. It was a better joke when the thing was called the skeleton. I kept it in because my wife likes it, and I know who I work for. So let's actually build a broker now. So I am going to clone this thing. We'll just get to GitHub and get the bytes. Hopefully the internet will cooperate with us. Any questions while we wait for this?
That's in Go, right?
It is in Go. Yep.
JavaScript?
It would be very easy to, fantastic. It would be very easy to re-implement this in JavaScript or any other language. It's pretty simple. Let's try this one more time. Bam. All right. So I'm going to show you the stock one first, and then we're going to code one. So to deploy this to OpenShift, I just had to type make push deploy OpenShift. It's going to build a binary for the broker. It's going to deploy and build a container image for it, deploy that into my OpenShift that's running in EC2, and it deploys a very, very simple example service. And that thing's going to pop up in the service catalog overview in the web console in a second here. It does not run with Builda yet, but it's created a new project called OSB Starter Pack. It deployed a cluster service broker resource. So here's an example of what the service broker resource that indicates your intent that the catalog should consume a broker. Never mind the error, that's completely expected. We're going to see a new one pop up, and it's going to look ready in just 1 second. But the spec for this thing is basically just a URL for where do I talk to it. You can also, we're not using TLS or anything, but you can say use this certificate bundle to authenticate this thing's TLS, and some knobs for how often do we want to go out and reconcile against this broker and say, what services do you have now? So you can see here, there's also a status, and this probably looks pretty familiar if you're used to Kubernetes resources. And hey, look at that. Lucky for us, right on time, the ready condition for this thing is true. So let's go back to the console. And we've got our example starter pack service. This is the Open Service Broker API logo here. But that's not super fun. So let's make one that's a little bit more fun. And since I'm up here and I have the bully pulpit, we're going to make a PaaS broker, which of course is Paul as a service. So when you go to implement your broker with this project, you basically have to do 4 things. You can wire in your own CLI options and implement so you implement a type that has the options. You implement a method that takes those options and makes a new instance of a business logic that has the broker's business logic. And you implement the business logic for your broker. So there's a very, very, very simple example here. And since I don't think that it would be entirely fascinating for me to like try to code a functional broker, we're just going to have a little fun here really quick. But this gives us a very good chance to talk about the representation of services in Open Service Broker API. So you can see here, yes, there we go. Is that better? You know, I've got this powerful X-ray vision, so I don't always understand the constraints of normal human beings. This is a YAML representation of the JSON that the service broker is going to hand back to the catalog that says, I have these services. So the name is example starter pack service. We'll call it Paul as a service. I'm going to keep that GUID. Put a new description in there. Paul as a service for OpenShift Commons. You might be able to tell I rarely use the keyboard on my laptop. We're going to get a new picture for this thing too. Hey, it's me. So services have metadata. Among them is the display name, image URL. There's a couple other things here that are kind of conventional across Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry, where actually Open Service Broker API originated. Services have plans, which are tiers of services. So in our database as a service example, a plan might be like a bronze plan where maybe you get a table space in a like multi-tenant database, and maybe when you get slash dotted, you upgrade to the gold tier that's like a dedicated database, no other tenants sapping your IOPS, etc. Plans themselves have descriptions, so let's put something more fun in here. The greatest plan ever coded, according to me. And plans can declare schemas for what parameters they support. I've got a couple boring ones in here for defaults. Let's get rid of this name one. We know the name already. Let's call this one Mohawk color. I wish I could have a clear Mohawk. That would be very cool. That's what I'm going to tell people when all this falls out. So let's see. The default, of course, is Red Hat Red. And our options are Red Hat Red, Kubernetes Blue, and Twitter chosen hot pink, which are all colors that I have had. That's enough to start with. So why don't we do this? I'm going to delete that cluster service broker that I just made. And I'm going to delete that project that I just made. And now I'm going to do that flow again, where I make this thing, I push it out, and deploy it back into OpenShift. It can be pushed to any registry. In this particular instance, I'm using Quay. You could push it to the OpenShift internal one. You could push it to Docker Hub, BYO registry. So that's pushed. It's going to recreate the project in a second here, and we're going to see a lovely new service pop up in the service catalog. Yeah, so there's a question about versioning, and we'll see this pop up in a minute here. So Open Service Broker API currently doesn't have a first-class notion of a version of a service. The pattern that seems to be pervasive in the community is to project versions onto plans. So you might have a plan that's like Postgres 9.2 and another plan that's 9.6. And since this is a high-level overview, I didn't go into the ins and outs of updating, but services can be plan updatable. So you provision on the bronze tier, you can update to the gold tier if your service supports it. And that seems to be the pattern for handling version upgrades. Now, that said, there is a frequent ask to have a more first-class version of versions to support richer flows around this. That's something that we very well might do in the future. So here we go. I've got a new service here. And I'll just stick this into the demo project too. And what you should have seen here is a drop-down allowing you to choose the Mohawk color, but apparently I have messed something up just a little bit. But we'll avoid binding to it. And hey, look at that. Since it didn't do any work, it was really fast. Take note. But there we go. That's how you make a new service with the OSB starter pack. So what's next for this is basically the goal is to have a really easy, fast way to make a new broker and iterate. Ideally, this will be like a batteries included experience where you get good practices for security. For example, we mentioned the RBAC rule that the Ansible service broker and template service broker check. I would like to have that built in. Also, an easy on-ramp and built-in baseline useful metrics for Prometheus so you can monitor things in production, and other lessons that we have learned building brokers at Red Hat. I hope to incorporate into this project so that you don't have to think. All you have to do is learn and absorb and iterate. And I want to say a note of thanks to Lily Chosik, who's been working on this project with me. She's awesome. Check her out on Twitter. And I have some resources in here for when we share this deck that call outs to Open Service Broker API, Service Catalog, the SIG in Kubernetes, Commons briefing where I go into exhaustive detail about all of these resources that we kind of hinted about today, link to the automation broker and the OSB starter pack. So thanks a lot.